Achut, am I audible to you?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay. So, what's the presentation you have got for today?
It's the decades thing, sir.
You got any slides to be shown or what?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, right. Go for it.
Just wait for a second.
Okay. Yeah. Take your time.
Okay, so this is the third part of the decade series. So I'll be focusing on the four more decades, 1860s to 1890s. These are decades were part of a larger era in American history called the Gilded Age, which was when rich people got richer. There's lots of industry happening. The term gilded and poor people were lots of poor people came. And the term Gilded Age itself, gilded means it looks really good and bright on the outside. It looks shiny on the outside, though it's in the inside it's often terrible and often bad and smelly and stuff. That's what gilded is. It's good in the outside and bad in the inside. That's kind of the concept of that age. So let's just go. So it will slowly emerge into this topic of the Gilded Age. So 1860s. So I did more of a photo presentation rather than the textual one this time. I'm just because some of the concept, it's better if there's lots of photos and stuff. This is the period where photography became a thing over drawing a thing, because the camera and stuff were invented. So these were the photographs now. So in the 1860s, the biggest event in America by far is the Civil War. So no doubt about that. So the president, it all started because back then the northern states were who were becoming lots of industrial states. They were all opposed to slavery, whereas the southern states, they were farming states and stuff. They wanted slavery because of all that labor they need to grow those crops. So you can see here, the blue states are associated with the northern states. Those are more industrial states, and then the southern states are in red in the map. You can see those are more of against slavery is pro-slavery state, because because they are farming states in the south. So that's where the tensions were growing between them, because many northerners did not want slavery. And then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States, which basically set off the Civil War of that war, because Abraham Lincoln was against he was against slavery. And while he tried to calm the southern fears down, he just doesn't want he won't make slavery illegal. The southern states still got too scared, and they formed their new country. All 11 of these southern states, it's all of them formed a new country called the Confederate States of America. And this is when a lot of the war began. So when the war first began, the Union, or what you call the United States, or the blue states in this map, they thought they were really going to be able to win in this. The Union, they thought they could easily capital. So their plan was this: to get the Mississippi River here, so that the Confederacy can be split into two, and they can all and capture the capital, Virginia, and then capture all these port cities. There's Wilmington, there's Jacksonville, there's New Orleans, all these port cities. These were the three major plans. Capturing the port cities plan came pretty successful. They were able to do it within a year. And then the other two were a little bit less successful. So especially the one to capture the capital in Richmond in Virginia here. It was not a far distance from the south. And what these light gray light blue states, by the way, those are called border states. They were pro-slavery. They did slavery before, but like they were also against joining the Confederate Union. They wanted to stay in the United States, and like many of them were close to banning slavery anyway, so it didn't matter. So like they were this close. So like the Union was this close to getting it, and yet they were struggling to go through it. Like the Confederates were actually good defenders and stuff, and they were even able to attack the Union in several ways. Though both of them ended in defeat eventually for the Union. So this is a very yeah. So Virgin like they tried to invade, but they were unsuccessful. And pretty soon, no, this one, no, they were able, they were able to do the second thing in their plan, which was to control the Mississippi River, which flowed around here. And like there is a very brilliant general, later president called Ulysses S. Grant that basically was invading Tennessee here, and like he was able to do some victories here when they were struggling here. And then he was eventually able to capture this major city called Vicksburg here, and like that's what's made that caused them to get the control of the Mississippi River. And then meanwhile, during the same time it's Vicksburg, there's a turning point in the war in there because there's a Confederate general named Robert E. Lee that basically was successfully defending its country against all these Union attacks. They tried numerous times not to invade the capital, they didn't. So Robert E. Lee tried to go on the offensive. He tried to go past Maryland and then into Pennsylvania, and then but he failed there. So like it's the screen is blocking me a bit. It's like how can I just make, yeah, that's better. Okay. Sorry about this. It's just some weird thing.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Just can.
Okay, so yeah, so like the pencil, he tried invading here. There's some black screen. It's roughly around there, and then the Union defeated them actually for the first. It wasn't the first victory. Like the Union was successful here, but it was the major victory. It's called the Battle of Gettysburg. Again, like that's when like the Union really got the victory, or got the energy momentum behind them, and they were able to not only push back the Confederates here, but pretty soon they were able to hold them off for any other. So like none of there's no other point where like the Confederacy invaded Union land. From now on, it's the Union invading Confederate land, and already Tennessee is pretty much gone from from the Union, like from the Confederacy. Like the Union captured a lot of it. And then like we saw Vicksburg going captured. And like all these port cities here, they were successful in capturing a lot of them due to their superior navy. Though both of them were having good fights. Like you can see, this is an example. There's new technology like machine guns and like ironclads, which are basically boats, but steel made boats, which are very hard to this hard to like shell and stuff to destroy basically. And like these were create both sides used them for the first time in this war, and it was one of the earliest war where they were used, and it led to naval superior, it led to like a revolution in naval combat, and like both, and like ultimately it was proven decisive for the Union as they were able to produce more of these, and like they were able to control rivers like the Mississippi and port cities. So like that was one major thing there. And then and then a lot and then like they captured Tennessee, Vicksburg, all these port cities. So and then because of Grant's success in that, Abraham Lincoln saw and he put him in charge of getting back Richmond here. So like he wanted a Grant to basically get Richmond. And then Grant devised the strategy with with to basically the rest of the country. First was to invade Atlanta and Georgia, which was a key city. Second was to get Mobile, Alabama, which was one of the few ports they still haven't got yet. And then third was to get Richmond, which was led by Grant himself. So at Richmond, it was slow and like steady, though like he was able to eventually reach the exurbs of Richmond, and he was forced to lay siege eventually that lasted for like nearly a year. But Atlanta went by a little quicker. After some time, they had to lay siege in Atlanta, and like it was for like a month, but then eventually they did. And then like he went, and then Sherman, which was the name of the general, he led a march through the Georgia countryside all the way into another city called Savannah. And like he basically took this entire region under control. And then he went to South Carolina and he was trying to do it. And like this was going very successful here. It's because until then the Union was not doing significantly well here to get like a lot of the territory they wanted. And so like Abraham Lincoln was really unpopular among the North for some time because it was that, and because of how bad the war. But like since this was taken place in 1864, that was the election year for Abraham Lincoln, and since all these victories came, the people suddenly found him very popular and they re-elected him. Meanwhile, and then after he got re-elected, not a long time after, Richmond was getting captured because Grant was able to break through, and like sure they were approaching here, and then like there's some invasion here in Arkansas, and like they were able to capture many lands here. Like all this stuff is getting into Confederate hands, and eventually Robert E. Lee had to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April 9th, 1865, which was the end of the Civil War by most accounts. It wasn't completely done because not every state surrendered, but like basically with all that territory, it was basically done. And then Abraham Lincoln himself got assassinated, unfortunately, like 5 days later. He was watching a play because like he was celebrating because he just finished the war. And like a deep Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln, and he was the first president to be assassinated in office. This during this time in 1860, and then John Wilkes Booth eventually died like about 2 weeks later because federal of federal troops getting into his home and setting it into fire here, and he got killed in the fire. Still, America lost a president and major president during this time, and he is known to be one of the greatest presidents because of how he was managed to stay calm and united even though with such a big crisis, and he made sure the country was together. And like after Abraham Lincoln came, like there's a period called Reconstruction because all these states they left the Union. They couldn't just be brought back into the Union normally. Like they had to be going through like some major process. So that's when and this came. So Abraham Lincoln tried to bring a cautious approach to it. Reconstruction, like he wanted to did sympathize with the Southerners and made sure, and like he wanted to make sure they get food and stuff and like other stuff. They didn't want to struggle them, and like he wants them to slowly get into the Union. However, there's other members of his party, which was the Republican Party, and like who wanted a more decisive action. They wanted civil rights for African Americans. They wanted reparations for all their years of being slaves and stuff. And that's what they called radical Republican at the time, and which you can see here how it is because many Southerners still wanted for first slavery, and they despised the North still because of their loss of the war. And like this Republican here, basically he was standing in the way of them trying to like basically protest against the black people who suddenly got their right to vote and stuff. So this is some of the time where like black people were even getting elected to office, which was unheard of the time. And like and it was all due to these politicians called radical Republicans. And like equality does seem to be enforced how good because of like Union troops present in the area. and like that's what basically was happening. And then like there's a after Abraham Lincoln, a Democrat named Andrew Johnson came to the presidency. He basically was trying to stop this, but the radical Republicans in the Congress, they impeached him, which was it was basically criminal charged him, and they nearly got him out of office because of that. And like his plans got subdued due to the radical Republicans. Over here, and like this is what Gilded Age starts to show. Oh, and during this era, like 1860s, 1865 is considered the start of it, right after the Civil War, and that's when like the Gilded Age seemed to, many people say, started during this time. And like this 1867, this is the first example of it. This is a man called Boss Tweed, and there's basically he runs a political machine in New York. This is the famous example of it. There's many examples, so this is the biggest example of it. And the political machines, they're basically political machines that basically work as machines to get voters for to the polls and stuff. So like they try Tammany Hall was the name of this political machine, and like they tried to support Democrat candidates for like governor of New York State, senator of New York, mayor of New York City, like all these positions they wanted them, and they were getting these voters who to rig the elections and stuff. And like in this particular instant, as soon as the person elected got support from Tammany Hall, they the elected people bring back money to its leader, namely Boss Tweed, that guy. And like he was making millions from this corruption and graft that was happening during this time. He eventually got caught because of political new cartoons like this, like that was published in newspapers. Many people saw who he was, and like eventually he got arrested, and and then he escaped to Spain for some reason because he had the money to, and then he and then like he got arrested there again and then died on there. So like that's what happened there. And then the final thing was like this industrialization, another thing. We already saw how industrialization with this occurred in the war. And then this 1869, this was the completion of the transcontinental railroad. So basically this railroad, it lasted from there's an ex there's a city in Nebraska called Omaha, and it connected with Sacramento, California here. So like until then, like railroads were not connected with the country. This was significant because it connected the entire country. So like there's railroad lines existing from Omaha to other major cities here, but like there was no the Western railroads and like the Eastern were separated until then, and they met here. There are two different railroad companies were building tracks all the way to this city in Utah, and then like they basically laid the last bolt together. This was where they laid the last bolt, the picture, and like that's when the railroad completed. And now what took like 4 months typically to get to the Western from this part to it now takes only 1 week. So like that definitely changed US travel forever in the region. So like that is a major thing there. And like this and it moves us to the 1870s. So like 1870s, this is when like a lot more stuff happened. So like 1870s, like this is a more continuum of the 1860s. These and like the reconstruction. So like reconstruction was continuing in the South. A lot of the southern states were like being held by Union troops, but it slowly started to change. Change as many white people were resisting this Union presence in the South, these Union troops coming into the South. And then like it all came ahead to in the and Ulysses S. Grant was the president during this time. He was the general in the 1860s in the Civil War. He became president and he helped expand more freedoms for African Americans. And it's like this was like the peak time for African Americans for like the past 100 years, like this and stuff. And this pretty soon started to fall as like more support degraded for him, and plus Grant was facing some unpopular sentiments due to like some corruption in his administration. Grant wasn't doing any of the corruption though. Like his cabinet members, his associates were doing some corruption, which made him feel like the bad man, even though he was not. He was actually a good man too. He was helping everyone, and like this was all creating more stir and stuff for everyone, and like with the corruption, like the Gilded Age, obviously, that's when like corruption was rising like anything. So like that's made sense there. And in 1876, this was the election here, and like basically like this is when it was a very tight election. You can see the results here. Like it was the Republican candidate won 185 electoral votes. The Democrat won 184 electoral votes. So like that's what the votes were. And electoral votes are basically how many votes a state it's basically gets. So like if a state, like let's say this state here, it has like 11 electoral votes. Like even it doesn't matter how big a candidate wins the state, like he could get 90% of the vote or win by less than 1% of the vote. He gets all the state's electoral votes. So that's the case there. So like that's how it was, and it was tight popular vote, and because of that, the Democrat overall won more votes, more popular votes than the Republican here in this election, even though the Republican won the popular vote. And it was so contested, Democrats, Republicans were arguing with each other. Here that in they came to a compromise of called the Compromise of 1877. So like basically, he they gave the Democrats affirmed Republican, this case Rutherford B. Hayes, the presidency, meaning like they affirmed that Republican would be president, but the Union troops would all have to leave the South. Like all these Union troops that were there enforcing all these black laws, like those were that at those had to leave, and like so like that's with all them leaving, like equality for African Americans also went down. Like segregation started this era. Jim Crow laws were there to basically give separate every public facility from schools to hospitals to even water fountains here. Here, like they're split in from white and colored people, and like colored people here, which included blacks and any major immigrant and that wasn't white, basically got the bad worse facilities and stuff for them. And like this was like put into infrastructure in many of these southern states. And like even northern states, some of them like many of the northern states, it was built in inherently. Like it was true, like it wasn't direct racism, but like it was many white people and black people definitely felt sentiments against each other, which caused some tension in these areas. It's like that's what basically was the case in the America. And like black people would have to wait for another seven for over 100 years till 1950s and 60s to get equal rights and stuff. And then like Native Americans, as more people went to West, like this was a common theme from the start. Native Americans were being pushed off their lands. And it's like many of them, they were slowly getting pushed. Like they were first pushed across these mountain ranges. And like as people moved to the industrial West, they pushed even further. And like eventually, like all these territories were getting into and like these and often Union troops would go and like defeat the Native Americans to force them into getting even smaller areas of like land for reservation. So like if they got this big of a land, the Unions forced them to get this and then like this. So like it was kind of like that they wanted more room for settlers. And at this one particular moment, it was called Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of Little Bighorn. It was occurring in this state around Montana. And it was basically where he was trying to make the true Indians move out of their land. However, the Native American and basically fought back and they actually killed everyone in this battle for they resisted pretty well against them and like this was a rare victory for American Indians. So basically that's a thing. It doesn't always end that way though. Like it was a big one. victory for them. There's other ones like the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, which was not as successful, and many women and children, Native American women and children died due to this. And then and finally, as industrialization rose, so did technology. So this was one of the major examples of technology. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb in 1879. He called it the incandescent light, and it was the beginning of not using candles, but rather using light bulbs, and like electric grids were flowing through this everywhere eventually throughout the United States. And like many of those electric grids from those 1880s and 1890s were still in use today. To this day, America has not upgraded them. So like that's a very, very powerful thing there. And like there was other inventions like the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell, and like all this stuff that were made. And like this was like the peak of technological innovation for many people, and for at least some time. And it will only continue escalate as we go into 1880s and stuff. 1880s. So like this was a very big Gilded Age. This was now where we truly get into like inside the Gilded Age. There was many events in the 60s and 70s, 1860s, 70s that were part of the Gilded Age, but 1880s is when like the Gilded Age was fully taking a swing. So there's monopolies and trusts were starting to rise during this time, and monopolies basically they're, you know what they are. They're basically control the supply of one good or something, and like they basically control all the market or that, and they have the dominance and in this market, meaning like no other competitor could really compete with them. And like this was the case. There's lots of monopolies though, like Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller are the two most famous. Andrew Carnegie was basically controlled the Carnegie Steel Mills and like US Steel basically. Yeah, and like he had a monopoly on the steel industry, which was really important because during this industrialization and stuff, a lot of steel companies were made, and like these were demand of steel rose up, which was the perfect time for him to get into the steel business. And he basically controlled all the steel mills and like all the steel factories, and like he was basically controlling them. And like he was a bit more generous than other wealthy people. Like he gave a lot of his money to the poor eventually. There's a he made a university after him, Carnegie Mellon University, which was a big major university. He gave a major library to the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There was a lot of stuff he did good for though like he still was a major monopoly. And John Rockefeller's the other one. He was the owner of Standard Oil, which was basically which is basically the first major oil company in the US. And like oil was now being used to power all this energy required for this industrialization and stuff. So like he controlled all these oil fields as you see here. In Ohio, there's 26 fields, and within one summer, John Rockefeller took control of 22 of those fields in the city in Ohio, in the city of Cleveland specifically. And like he was able to monopolize oil throughout the country. And like at his peak, he controlled 3% of the entire US wealth at the time. And like today, if you adjust for inflation, he still would be the richest man to ever exist on the globe if you adjust for inflation. And having over $500 billion or something if you adjust so like that's crazy there's and like while these guys were getting rich, like people had negative and positive sentiments. Negative sentiments called them robber barons because they were hoarding wealth for themselves of these top people. Well, while many people who thought of them positively called them like benefits to society because of like how it showed them. Like many of them they didn't and like they didn't really like feel any guilt of being this rich. Like they felt justified. They felt like they did hard work and they did do hard work. Like Andrew Carnegie started out as a Scottish immigrant. He was working menial jobs and he was rising the ranks and so through his hard work. But still, it was even though it was for them really good, the vast majority were feeling very bad. Like here you can see this is one of the major things that was happening. Like people were living in terrible housing, in crammed housing. Like there was often no bathroom or any clean facilities in these cities. So and like crime was high and like food was there was a struggle to bring food, and like this was not just for them, like a lot of Americans were feeling the brunt of this. So like basically that was the thing during this time, and like immigrants were coming in to the workflow, and like immigrants were coming for these jobs and stuff, and like they were able, since they were accepting a lower wage, often these immigrants were taking over the jobs, which steamed a rise in anti-immigrant sentimentation. So like an example was in the Western United States, many Chinese Americans were coming in, and the government eventually passed the Chinese Exclusion Act by after many white peoples were losing their jobs to Chinese laborers in the area, and like this basically banned Chinese immigration for like the foreseeable future. It won't be until like 1965 where like Chinese people were allowed for major immigration. So there was still small number, but like the Chinese population dropped by 30% due to this act in the USA. So like that was one of the major things. And then Indian land, and like the Dawes Act of 1887, we saw like how American Indians were basically
But then,
being pushed out of their land and for a
but then
long
Achyut,
meeting.
but Achyut, the visual says, I mean, it says something about 1910. Is it really belonging to the 1880s? Because
Where
we are seeing it's at the bottom of that particular advertisement in 1910. The Department of the Interior sold. So
this was
it's
like
like,
this was created from the Indian land. So like this was the Dawes Act image. Like it was and like it showed like the prolonging effects of this act. Like it was still being used in 1910, but like the same type of thing was existing in the 1880s, and particularly 1887 was when it started, I'd say. It's like this
got it,
was
got it,
the effect of the act.
got it. Yeah,
Yeah,
correct.
so like it was not there was like they were just slowly getting removed of their land, and then like basically by 1887 this Dawes Act basically he gave Indians like base American Indians like out of their land completely and told them to assimilate or like get into white society and like get a home and get a proper home, get like a stuff and like that, don't live like that, and like they were all these stuff, and like they were often getting these children of Native Americans, and like they were trying to, and they were educating them like all these white stuff, and like eventually they were losing their culture and everything from that because of this, and like it was proven they eventually repealed it much later, but like the lasting impact of that act was still made felt. And like with all this like poor people here and like stuff, and like all this worker chaos, like there was increase in like radical political ideologies during this time, namely like socialism and communism, and then like those stuff, like those were getting increased traction among workers because they were feeling so very like they were having like lots of struggles and stuff, and like that's how like the Soviet Union, China became communist because of all those worker struggles. Those, and like there's some of those sentiments here, and like many of the there's also anarchists that were coming into it, which are basically no government type of people. So, unlike people rule themselves, and like basically in 1887, this was a major one called Haymarket Square riot in Chicago, which was basically where workers and stuff were protesting, and then like an anarchist group of people, well, basically they fired some shots, and like There's 7 people end up getting killed. 4 people were anarchists, and like it was chaos and everything. And like America eventually was and like there was many people who were losing faith and like in this very violence and stuff, and like that's like a crazy, it was crazy and stuff. There's some it's not to mention there was some reform that was happening during this time. 1889 was the year the first Hull House was created, and the Hull House was basically, it was made to help immigrants like adjust to America basically and make sure they get better conditions and stuff. And like it was kind of like seen as like some mayor for like some duty, and like there's this program extended to a lot of cities and stuff, and they were helping immigrants learn English and like get into better jobs and stuff, get higher education and like all this stuff. And like with
Okay.
this stuff.
Ajit will start a new window if you don't mind. It's about 40 minutes now. We'll start a
Okay,
new window and continue.
okay, sir.
Yeah, once again.